Okay, welcome back to whatever this podcast is. I'm joined today by two of my favorite economists, James Zuklo and Gulnara Nolan. They don't need any introduction because I'm not going to do one. We were just having a chat because we like to do that about, our different experiences living in the UK, New Zealand, Australia. I've got the least knowledge of these sorts of things because I've only lived in Australia and New Zealand. So I'm pretty excited to hear about other people's lived experience. I was thinking a fun topic to discuss would be distance to market and ultimately how, coming from New Zealand, I've always been a long way from the rest of the world. And I've noticed that certain things are really expensive. And when you travel to the US or to the UK, suddenly a lot of other things are cheaper. And I was wondering, how do we conceptualize that? How do we think about distance to market? And how can the idea of distance to market affect productivity and income for a country? When we think about distance to market, we're talking about the idea of there being a long way from the country to some sort of center of economic gravity, a place where there's a lot of potential customers. Now, when we think about the center of economic gravity for the world, that's been slowly shifting east. But there are actually big centers of gravity associated with high populations in China, India, Europe, and North America. And not just high populations, but also high capacity to pay and the such. Now, New Zealand and Australia are a long way from these. And then as a result, that might affect their performance in terms of productivity, in terms of incomes. But then when we look at a country like the UK, where James is currently residing, there's a bit of a paradox. The UK is right next to Europe, and yet incomes in the UK relative to Australia and New Zealand have declined sharply over the last 20 years. Gross domestic income in the United Kingdom used to be 20% higher than New Zealand around 2000, and the same as Australia. By 2020, it was the same as New Zealand and 20% below Australia's. How can that happen when they're so close to market and Australia and New Zealand are far away? Has something changed through time? Is there a strange way to think about distance to market? Are there other factors that matter rather than distance? Who knows? We're just going to have a chat about the ideas and see if we can figure some of this out. So before we kick off and sort of talk about our lived experience, I'm keen to pass over to James to get his thoughts and see if there was anything I missed in that discussion or any stories he wants to kick us off on.
Thanks, Matt. I suppose that's a big question you're kicking off with there. What is the UK's productivity paradox? How come, after growing so well through the 90s and 2000s, the UK hit the 2008 crisis and then has flatlined in GDP and income since? And I can tell you, I really feel that too, having moved to the country around that time. How rich I was going to get. But as you say, even though it's very close to market, although we might talk about how there are more trade barriers going up in the UK at the moment with Brexit and others barriers to its closest markets. Even though that's happened, you can still see this flatlining income. And it's probably, isn't it, because trade is not the most important thing for determining national income and productivity.
Oh, that's very true. That's very true. So when it comes to Brexit, for example, how have you felt that in the UK? Do you feel like increasing trade barriers have generated this sort of own penalty to entering the market that would look something like distance to market?
Yeah, I preface this by saying I'm not an expert in the economics of Brexit. I think what you really notice day to day living in London, and I think it's important to say I live in London, not just the UK, because the UK's cities are very, very different. And London is far bigger than any other city in the UK. It's often said that in the UK, there is a largest city, London, but there is no like second largest city because you go from a city of 10 million people in London down to a city, the second largest, Birmingham, which is only about 1.5 million people. So far, far smaller. And London is the center of commerce, it's the center of politics. And in London, which is previously a very international city, with perhaps half of the residents not born in London, you notice that there are labor shortages in a lot of places. That people who used to arrive here from Europe and work in the service sector quite often struggle to do so. And that's caused problems for a lot of industries, particularly, I think, anecdotally, in retail and in hospitality, where they've really struggled to find staff. And that's, of course, led to closure of businesses, higher prices. And you can see that even though you're close to market, the barriers created by restrictions on the free movement of people, which, of course, is a part of trade that's often not talked about in the papers, but is extremely important for moving human capital around, have caused real consequences on the ground for people who are living in London.
Oh, fascinating, fascinating. I want to relitigate a point you made at the start there. None of us are experts on this particular issue. We're not trade economists, but we do have a strong interest in trade. We're all trained economists, and we're just really interested in the topic. Now, when it comes to thinking about what's happening in the UK versus Australia and New Zealand, it's nice to think a bit more broadly as well. There was a recent piece of work by Van Reenen that I saw on Twitter where he described that a lot of what was happening in the UK was a lack of investment when you compare it to similar European countries. But a lot of these countries have experienced very weak total factor productivity growth. Now, for people that aren't sure what that is, that's the idea that, using the same inputs, the same capital, the same work time, the same intermediate consumption, you end up being able to make more if you have better ideas and better ways of organizing yourself to make it. And that increase would be total factor productivity. Economists sometimes call this technology, and it's a bit of a nebulous concept. But in the way that's been growing weekly across the world, and then especially across a lot of European countries, it looks like it's a lot on the investment side in the UK. But if we're to understand that broader technology argument, we need to understand more about Europe. Now, Gulnara, you are the most seasoned European traveler I've met, and you lived across a number of countries there. Can you tell me a bit about your experience with Europe and then your shock, should I say, coming to New Zealand?
That's very funny description of my experience. Thanks, Matt, and hi, James, and hi, everyone online. So when I lived in Europe, and I have traveled across almost all European countries while I was studying there, so I had completely different experiences with variety of goods and prices. But when I moved to New Zealand, quite a while ago, I had a shock in terms of how scarce the variety was presented, say, in supermarkets. And New Zealand has roughly 2 big supermarket chains. And say you're going there, you're after a biscuit or sausages, there will be a limited variety of products in market, in the supermarket. But while in Europe, you would have hundreds of providers, say, of yogurt, say in France. And due to this competition between the providers, you would always find the good you are after, and they could be even in promotion. So you would end up getting things cheaper in Europe compared to New Zealand. Although when I was in Iceland, Reykjavik, the capital, I was shocked how empty supermarket shelves were, which also aligns with our distance to market arguments you're making here. And the second shock I have experienced when I moved to New Zealand was how expensive goods are in supermarkets. It was shocking to see how even dairy products such as milk, meat, butter are more expensive in a dairy exporting country like New Zealand. So you would end up paying, say, $5 to $6 for a chunk of butter. Ironically, in Australia, the New Zealand produced butter is cheaper than it is in New Zealand. Do you guys have any idea why this is the case?
Well, New Zealand is a strong exporter of dairy products. So in a general year, New Zealand will account for about 30 to 50% of exports of dairy products around the world. I'm speaking on figures that I remember from the days of being a macro forecaster, so it may well have changed a lot since 2012, 2014. But assuming it's the same, it's around 30 to 50% of trade. Only about between 1 and 2% of global production of dairy product is in New Zealand because so much is domestic. But with such a strong part of the export market and relying on picking residual prices and picking the best return when they trade. We have a big global company in Fonterra that is trading on this world market. And so, dry conditions in somewhere like China will drive dairy products in New Zealand. And that strong attitude of trying to charge a price that matches world prices will come through. Now, why are they higher again in New Zealand? That speaks to the idea of scale. Ultimately, to provide in New Zealand supermarkets, there are underlying fixed costs and you have small markets. When you provide in a city like Sydney that has a larger population than New Zealand, or maybe about the same population as the whole of New Zealand, a lot of those fixed costs get washed down and you're able to lower prices to some degree. Do you have any additional thoughts on that, James? I remember you used to work at NZIAR and would be exposed to constant discussions of dairy prices yourself.
I mostly had a question for you, Matt. I thought that was a great explanation, but then how does this relate to policy? So if we're in New Zealand, and which none of us are, but supposing we were, which we used to be, then would we be better off in New Zealand if we put in place barriers to prevent those prices overseas being transmitted to the New Zealand domestic market? Are New Zealanders losing out because of the trading strength of Fonterra and those open borders that New Zealand's had for so long? Could you increase New Zealanders' welfare by restricting Fonterra's ability to export?
I love that question because there's a very explicit introductory economics argument, which is quite a strong argument, but would immediately leave me open to vicious potential attacks. So I'm actually thinking to argue it twofold and then open the floor to both of you to come at me. So the first way to go is to say, well, ultimately, if the price of products was cheaper for New Zealand citizens, that would sound wonderful. That would sound like an income boost for those citizens. But the fact that we're selling the products for their highest available price overseas immediately means that's income for New Zealanders. And then if we were to go and we would try to subsidize those products within New Zealand, well, that would lead to a situation where there's a transfer between the exporter and the importer. And we would either see exports being taken away from and a decline in overall income, or if they were allowed to trade overseas and then not domestically, it would lead to this cottage industry where there would be shortages of dairy products domestically because there's actually excess demand at that new lower price. And you see a lot of this happening with the decision to subsidize oil in places like Venezuela and Azerbaijan, as ultimately they make a choice to lower domestic income somewhat so that a really salient and important price for citizens in the country is kept down. Now, the view would be, let's get the most efficient price we can. And if we're worried about the distribution of income, we can tax that and we can redistribute to people that are in need within the country. Where things get tricky, and so why I want to raise a second point here, is if we have some sort of large increase in world dairy prices, and that leads to a situation where land and resources get allocated into dairy, potentially excessively because people are getting overexcited and overinvesting in dairy, and that leads to other industries shutting down that would otherwise be profitable. And if there's large fixed costs associated with resetting up manufacturing industries, that could lead to what's called Dutch disease, in a situation where New Zealand as a whole ends up a bit worse off because of this variability in prices and people not fully being able to insure themselves against risk. We can see that with how Norway deals with oil in terms of having a big wealth fund where they take revenue from the oil industry and they save it. They use it to have an intervention where they're lowering the exchange rate now and where they can reallocate resources through time in order to limit the extent of damage from potential Dutch disease. Now, these become complex empirical questions, and they touch on an idea that I was keen for people to chat about later called dynamic comparative advantage. But I think it's an important thing to think about. And the easy answer of just going and subsidizing prices, well, it's a little bit too easy, and it can inadvertently lead to harm if it's done without thought and instead just as a political instrument to get attention.
So how do you deal with income distributions here? I'm sorry, maybe I'm spending too long on this, but I think this will be a very salient question for a lot of listeners. that Fonterra and its shareholders may benefit a lot from that exposure. But and let's just say absent of price shocks that may cause some Dutch disease immediately, how do we deal with those distributional questions of who it is that benefits and who it is that pays the price?
Well, Fonterra's shareholders are, for the most part, New Zealand farmers, so they're domestic residents. They have to pay income tax on that income. So if we have a progressive tax system and a set of transfers, such as unemployment benefits, those can be used to make sure that people that would maybe worst off in that situation are protected from a downturn in their income, while also making sure that the people receiving the gain pay what could be perceived a fair share of that to government in order to redistribute. Now, exactly what is right there is a complex question, because you know what? Economists love to frickin' say, do this with taxes, do that. This is the right thing to do because I wrote down an equation. I mean, good for you, mate. Okay. Ultimately, people are allowed to have different value systems, and those can lead to very different tax and benefit policies. I mean, if you go back and read the blog, which is currently broken, I believe, because there's a back end issue. But if you go there, you'll see that there's tax policies I said I would prefer, but I always tried to preface it on, this is because of my set of values. That's not coming as an economist, which helps me understand the trade-offs. It's because of the values I hold. So in terms of mentioning a specific policy, we really need a conversation as a society about how we then deal with these things and good information about how they work. And an economist's role there is to provide that information. We're not in New Zealand right now, so I haven't really paid any attention to the data. I don't even know if there's any sort of argument for Dutch disease over there right now. So we'll just assume that economists over there are doing a wonderful job. They all wear wonderful suits and talk very well, so I'm sure they are.
We certainly talked about it a lot when I was working at NZIER, when we were thinking about the impact of productivity shocks. And I think what I take from what you said, Matt, is that even for someone who's promoting very free and easy trade policies like you in that answer, in a descriptive sense sometimes, even you then think that that may need to be balanced by other policies that are not so obviously free market as some people may call them, to deal with distributional consequences. And but those two things are not contradictory. In fact, they can be complementary.
Yes, we are very much Caldor Hicks. Yeah, that's how we work. What are
Well,
your
that's one
thoughts
for
there,
the
Gulnara?
nerds.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Gulnara's nodding in agreement with a big smile on her face here. I'm receiving a warning that we're nearly out of time, and we've only covered the first bullet of the things I was keen to chat about. Well, one thing I do want to touch on, because I think it's a good issue to touch on when thinking about these things, is what is the weightless economy, and how is the growing weightless economy affecting distance from market? So I'll also link in the post, there is a Australian Treasury paper discussing distance from market for the UK and Australia as the center of gravity of the world economy has shifted east through time. And so you would expect that to move Australia and New Zealand closer to market and the UK further from it. And it has, but not really by that much. The UK is still much closer to the center of economic gravity. In that way, if there has been a change in how distance from market itself is functioning, it's not so much coming from the shift in the center of gravity, but it's coming from the fact that the goods and services that are traded are of a very different nature. So if you look at Australia and New Zealand, we have Mind Your Own Business, MYOB, which is a piece of accounting software, which is from Australia. You have the much better and larger Xero, which is, founded in New Zealand, where there's much better coffee. And then in that instance, these two accounting platforms, they were weightless in terms of, you can use them in any country as a subscription service, and the labor can be set up in Australia and New Zealand, while the service can be used anywhere without a transportation costs. It's not like it has to be shipped across borders. You've also seen the same thing happening with film, where both in Australia and New Zealand, there's a lot of film services associated with editing and post-production that occur in those countries, and they've been able to build up small hubs that do those things. So the weightless economy, where there doesn't need to be physical, tangible movement of goods and services. The person doesn't need to move to do a haircut. The piano doesn't need to be shipped because it's about things that don't have weight, could be fundamentally changing the way these things work and providing a comparative advantage for Australia and New Zealand that has helped boost incomes here and not somewhere like the United Kingdom. Have you guys sort of seen any evidence of this or any sort of things happening that you feel suggest that? Or do you think that argument's a bit oversimplified?
But I think what you're hitting on here, Matt, is another really interesting point about trade, which is economies of scale. That there's this idea that even in the absence of comparative advantage, some countries, some sectors, some firms may trade because as capital flows in there, they build these economies of scale with increasing returns to scale, as economists call it, so that as you grow, things actually get cheaper to produce rather than remaining the same cost to produce as you grow. So once you have a larger industry somewhere, it's actually cheaper for that to grow. It can provide things at a lower cost than elsewhere, and that means you can get some exporting advantage. And that then leads governments to think, well, could we stimulate these industries locally? I think these are often called domestically infant industry arguments, where you invest and try to help an industry grow by subsidizing it. Could you then reach those economies of scale that allow it to be a very competitive export industry and be able to end those subsidies? And of course, those are quite complex and contested arguments in economics. And I don't think there's one clear-cut answer to that yet. There's all sorts of different ways of doing these things. Some cases they're accused of being subsidies that go on forever for particular industries. In other cases, people often point to places like South Korea or chip manufacturing in Taiwan. They seem now to be extremely successful global exporters. But certainly when you look at somewhere like London, I think you can see things like the financial services industry here, which is so incredibly international, or the legal industry, which is again incredibly international. It's very large in London. It exports widely across the world, and these are these weightless industries as well. So I wondered if you thought that perhaps these ideas of increasing returns to scale could help us understand why it is that some of these weightless industries do typically grow in multiple countries as well, rather than just having a specialization in one place, which I think is where comparative advantage might take you.
Yeah, I mean the idea of a hub that represents some weightless industry in a certain area is an important point, which has been used. I mean, I remember global financial crisis in New Zealand. There was talk about using it as an opportunity to build up New Zealand as an internet hub related to internet technology. Completely vague, but then there was substantial investment in infrastructure related to that, which actually means that, you know, fiber internet in New Zealand is quite good. It's definitely better than in Sydney, which was surprising to us when we came here. The hard thing with a lot of these arguments, and I was glad you touched on the point that the UK is actually a lot more service-based. And so one of the big flaws with focusing on Australia and New Zealand overperforming because of weightless industries is the fact that the UK has been using that to their advantage for a longer time as well, and also has substantial film industries in the same way. When we come to weightless industries, the really hard thing is thinking about, okay, if it requires scale and it requires a lot of cross-border networks, how exactly do we measure that in terms of a country's economic contribution and who that goes to? Work has, in a sense, become international. And, you know, coming from a tax background, we're not sure where to tax income. We're not even sure where workers are resident, as well as the firms. And we get a situation where you could have an argument where if we invest in these natural monopolies as a government, we can help improve outcomes for that sector if it was going to stay resident where it is, and if it was going to be tax resident there, and if workers themselves would stay in that position. But once you've invested in that industry, you just become a cog on a horse, moving towards where the industries and their tax status end up moving to places that offer more favorable tax status, or where there are agglomeration benefits for those workers and they can enjoy the amenities of living in somewhere like London or New York rather than a small place like Wellington. So, like you say, there's a lot of complicated issues. And the weightless economy sounds like a great narrative device for something that a small country would invest in, to be Taiwan with the chip manufacturing industry, to be Bangladesh with shirts. But ultimately, it's complicated. So I think, having not answered anything, we're probably in a good place to finish up, since Zoom is screaming at me that it's going to kick us off in 1 minute. So I'd like to thank Gulnara and James for allowing me to talk a lot and also informing me of a whole lot of interesting things. Is there anything
Thank you, Matt.
you guys are keen to finish on?
No, thank you for the fascinating discussion, both James and Matt. So,
And we'll see you next time.
Indeed.
yeah.
Au revoir. Bye.
Indeed.